June 26, 1522. The horizon off the coast of Rhodes darkened not with storm clouds, but with sails. 700 Ottoman ships materialized from the Aegean, their hulls packed with 20,000 soldiers, their decks bristling with the most advanced artillery the world had ever seen. Standing on the massive stone ramparts of Rhodes, watching this armada approach, Grandmaster Philippe Villiers de l'Isle-Adam understood that everything his order had built over 2 centuries was about to be tested in fire and blood. The Knights Hospitaller had ruled this island since 1309, transforming it into the most formidable fortress in the Mediterranean. Now, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent himself was coming to tear it all down. The story of how a few hundred knights and several thousand defenders held out for 6 months against the full might of the Ottoman Empire is one of the most remarkable defensive stands in military history. It's a tale of cutting-edge military engineering, psychological warfare, underground battles fought in pitch darkness, treachery from within, and courage that bordered on the suicidal. This is the story of the Siege of Rhodes, when medieval chivalry met the artillery of a new age and the thunder of Ottoman bombardment shook the foundations of Christendom itself. To understand why the Ottomans were so desperate to take Rhodes, you have to understand what the Knights Hospitaller represented. Founded in Jerusalem in 1110 as a religious military order, the Hospitallers were originally dedicated to protecting Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. But as Crusader territories fell one by one to Muslim reconquest, the order evolved into something more dangerous, a disciplined fighting force of warrior monks who answered to no king and feared no enemy. When Acre, the last Crusader stronghold in Palestine, fell to the Mamluks in 1291, the Hospitallers retreated first to Cyprus, then set their sights on Rhodes. Between 1306 and 1310, they conquered the island from its Byzantine Greek rulers and established their new headquarters on this strategic outpost in the eastern Mediterranean. From Rhodes, the knights became more than just defenders of Christendom. They became pirates, raiders, and a constant thorn in the side of Ottoman expansion. Their galleys prowled the Aegean Sea, attacking Muslim shipping, disrupting trade routes between Constantinople and Egypt, and providing a base for Christian corsairs who treated Ottoman merchants with the same brutality that Barbary pirates showed to Christian vessels. For the Ottomans, Rhodes was an unacceptable provocation, a Christian dagger pointed at the heart of their empire from just off the southern coast of Anatolia. The Ottomans had tried once before to eliminate this threat. In 1480, Sultan Mehmed II, the same ruler who had conquered Constantinople and destroyed the Byzantine Empire, sent 70,000 men against Rhodes under the command of Messi Pasha. The siege lasted 3 months and ended in complete Ottoman failure. The knights, led by Grandmaster Pierre d'Aubusson, had repelled assault after assault, with d'Aubusson himself wounded 5 times while fighting on the walls. The Ottomans lost thousands of men and retreated in humiliation. Mehmed was furious and planned to return, but his death in 1481 saved Rhodes for another generation. But the Ottomans never forgot. Over the next 4 decades, they grew stronger, conquering the Balkans, defeating the Mamluks, capturing Egypt, and establishing control over most of the eastern Mediterranean. By 1520, when Suleiman ascended to the throne at age 26, the Ottoman Empire was the most powerful state on earth. Young, ambitious, and determined to surpass his illustrious predecessors, Suleiman saw Rhodes as unfinished business. The Knights Hospitaller were the last remnant of the Crusades, an anachronism that had to be eliminated. More practically, Rhodes controlled key maritime routes, and its conquest would give the Ottomans complete dominance over the eastern Mediterranean. In 1521, Philippe Villiers de l'Isle-Adam was elected Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller. Born in 1464 into French nobility, Philippe was a veteran warrior who had fought in naval battles across the Mediterranean. At 57, he was experienced, pragmatic, and under no illusions about what was coming. The moment he assumed leadership, he began preparing for the inevitable Ottoman assault. He sent urgent messages to every Christian monarch in Europe, begging for reinforcements, supplies, and financial support. The response was silence. The kings of Europe were too busy fighting each other. France and the Holy Roman Empire were locked in bitter rivalry over control of Italy. England was consumed with Henry VIII's domestic concerns. The Pope offered prayers but no soldiers. Only Sir John Rawson, prior of the Order's Irish House, answered the call, arriving alone to stand with his brothers. Philippe wasn't surprised by Europe's indifference. The knights would stand alone as they had in 1480, but this time they had advantages the previous generation lacked. Over the 4 decades since the last siege, Rhodes had been transformed into arguably the most advanced fortress in the world. The medieval walls had been completely rebuilt according to the latest principles of military architecture. After the 1480 siege and a devastating earthquake in 1481, Grand Master d'Aubusson, Del Carretto and others had invested enormous resources in modernising the defences. The old vertical walls designed to resist scaling ladders and siege towers were replaced with massive sloping ramparts designed to deflect cannon fire. The main walls were thickened to over 30 feet in some places, backed with earth and rubble that absorbed the impact of stone projectiles. The dry moats were doubled in width, reaching 60 feet across and 30 feet deep, too wide to bridge easily, and deep enough that attackers climbing down one side would be exhausted before climbing up the other. Most innovative were the low bastions and bulwarks that projected from the walls, designed specifically for artillery defence. These structures allowed defenders to bring flanking fire against any attacker approaching the walls, creating killing zones where crossfire from multiple directions could devastate assault columns. The old medieval merlons and crenellations were replaced with sloping parapets suitable for mounting cannon. Gun ports were added at multiple levels, creating tiers of artillery fire. The Tower of Italy, one of the most exposed positions, had been encased in a massive round bulwark with 3 stacked levels of cannon, capable of delivering devastating firepower in every direction. But Philippe had another advantage that would prove crucial, a Venetian military engineer named Gabriele Tadino da Martinengo. Tadino was something rare in that era, a true Renaissance man who combined practical engineering skill with theoretical knowledge of mathematics, physics, and the emerging science of ballistics. He had been stationed in Crete, working for Venice, but when he learned of the impending Ottoman attack on Rhodes, he escaped by small boat against Venetian orders and made his way to the island. He wanted to test his skills and innovations against the greatest siege warfare experts in the world, the Ottoman Turks. Philippe immediately recognised Tadino's value and admitted him into the order as an honorary knight of the Lang of Italy. Tadino's first contribution was methodical and unglamorous, but ultimately crucial. He supervised a comprehensive survey of every inch of ground surrounding the city, precisely measuring distances from the walls to every rock, tree and elevation that might provide cover for attackers or positions for artillery. These measurements were distributed to every gun captain in the fortress, allowing them to pre-sight their cannon on specific ranges. When the Ottomans eventually appeared, the defenders would know exactly where every enemy position was and how to hit it without wasting precious ammunition on ranging shots. Tadino also improved the fortress's counter-battery positions, strengthening gun emplacements to survive return fire and calculating optimal fields of fire to suppress Ottoman artillery. But his most important preparations involved what would become the decisive factor in the siege, underground warfare. Philippe's garrison was small but elite. He had approximately 600 brother knights, the actual members of the order, each one a trained professional warrior who had taken monastic vows of poverty, chastity and obedience. These weren't just soldiers. They were warrior monks who saw combat as a religious calling, and who had rules of engagement that literally mandated they stand their ground, against any odds rather than retreat. Supporting the knights were about 1,500 mercenaries, professional soldiers from across Europe, Italians, Spanish, Germans, English, who fought for pay but who were experienced veterans. The local population of Rhodes, both Greek Orthodox Christians and a smaller Jewish community, contributed another 5,000 or so able-bodied men to the defence, manning walls, serving artillery, and providing logistical support. All told, Philippe had perhaps 7,000 defenders, though only the knights and mercenaries could be considered truly combat effective. The defence was organised according to the order's traditional system of longues, or tongues, representing different regions of Europe. There was the Longue of France, of Auvergne, of Provence, of Aragon, of Castile, of Italy, of England, and of Germany. Each longue was assigned responsibility for a specific section of the walls, turning the defence into a matter of national honour. If the English sector fell, it would be a stain on English courage. If the Italian bastion was breached, Italian honour would be forfeit. This system created intense competition and pride among the defenders, each national contingent determined to prove their section was the strongest. Philippe also made a critical strategic decision. He ordered all crops on the island outside the city walls to be harvested or destroyed. Every well beyond the walls was poisoned or filled in. Every building that might provide shelter for attackers was demolished. The Ottomans would find no food, no water, and no cover once they landed. They would have to bring everything with them or ship it from Anatolia, a logistical nightmare that would stretch Ottoman supply lines and hopefully weaken their army before the actual siege began. At the harbour entrance, a massive iron chain was stretched across the water, preventing Ottoman ships from entering the port. Behind this chain, the Order's fleet of galleys was anchored, ready to sortie if opportunity arose. The Knights Hospitaller were as ready as they could be. Now they could only wait and watch the horizon. The Ottoman fleet that appeared on June 26, 1522 was overwhelming in its scale. Contemporary sources vary on exact numbers, but most agree there were between 400 and 700 ships, carrying an initial assault force of 20,000 men. The fleet was commanded by Çoban Mustafa Pasha, an experienced Ottoman admiral, but everyone knew the real commander was still en route. Sultan Suleiman himself was coming, bringing with him the main Ottoman army. This wasn't going to be a raid or a punitive expedition. This was going to be total war prosecuted by the Ottoman Emperor in person. The landings began immediately. Ottoman troops poured ashore at multiple points around the island, establishing fortified camps and supply depots. The knights made no attempt to contest the landings. They knew they couldn't stop the Ottomans on the beaches, and trying would only waste men and expose them to the Ottoman fleet's firepower. Instead, they watched from the walls as the siege army deployed, counting banners, estimating numbers, noting where artillery positions were being established. On July 28, 1522, Sultan Suleiman himself arrived with reinforcements that brought the Ottoman army to over 100,000 men. Contemporary accounts describe him riding through the camps on a white horse, reviewing the troops who had assembled to conquer Rhodes in his name. At 28 years old, Suleiman was young, energetic, and determined to make his mark on history. He would eventually rule for 46 years and earn his epithet the Magnificent through military conquests, legal reforms, and cultural achievements. But in July 1522, he was still proving himself, and Rhodes was to be his first great test as Sultan. Suleiman made his headquarters on elevated ground southeast of the city, from where he could observe the entire fortress and coordinate the siege. He had brought with him some of the most advanced artillery in the world. Ottoman bronze foundries were producing cannon that exceeded anything in Christian Europe. There were massive bombards capable of firing stone balls weighing 300 kilograms, culverins firing 20-pound iron shot, and countless smaller pieces. The Ottomans had learned from their failure in 1480. This time they brought overwhelming firepower and the determination to use it until the walls of Rhodes were reduced to rubble. The bombardment began on July 29th, and from that moment until the surrender in December, it barely stopped. Day and night, the Ottoman guns hammered the walls of Rhodes. The sound was described by defenders as like continuous thunder, a roar that never ceased, that drove men to the edge of madness, that made sleep impossible and conversation difficult. Stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds slammed into the massive ramparts with impacts that shook buildings hundreds of yards away. Incendiary devices were lobbed over the walls to start fires in the city. The psychological effect was devastating, but the physical damage was less than the Ottomans hoped. This was because the walls of Rhodes represented the cutting edge of defensive architecture. The sloping faces of the bastions caused many cannonballs to ricochet off rather than penetrating. The massive thickness of the walls, backed with earth and rubble, absorbed impacts that would have shattered medieval fortifications. When sections of wall were damaged, defenders worked through the night to repair them, packing breaches with stone, earth, sand bags, and even bales of cloth and wool that could absorb cannon shot. The knight's own artillery responded with devastating effectiveness. Thanks to Tadino's precise measurements, Hospitaller gun crews could hit Ottoman artillery positions with remarkable accuracy. The defenders had fewer guns than the attackers, but they used them more efficiently. Ottoman batteries that began the siege with 10 or 12 pieces were often reduced to half that number within weeks, as Hospitaller counter-battery fire destroyed guns and killed crews. By September, Ottoman artillery strength was roughly half what it had been at the beginning of the siege, though Suleiman continuously brought in replacement guns from Anatolia. But artillery alone couldn't take Rhodes. The walls were simply too strong. Suleiman knew this. He had brought something more dangerous than cannon. He had brought sappers, thousands of miners from Bosnia and Wallachia, specialists in underground warfare who would dig beneath the walls and bring them down with explosives. This was where the siege would really be decided, not in the thunder of artillery on the surface, but in the darkness beneath the earth. Ottoman mining operations began in August. Teams of sappers would dig approach trenches toward the walls, protected from defensive fire by wooden screens and earthen berms. Once they got close enough, they would tunnel beneath the fortifications, shoring up the tunnel roof with wooden timbers as they went. When they reached a point directly under a section of wall or bastion, they would excavate a chamber, pack it with gunpowder, light the fuse, and retreat. The explosion would collapse the tunnel and, if all went according to plan, bring down the fortification above it. Against most fortresses of that era, mining was devastatingly effective. But Rhodes had Gabriele Tadino. Tadino had prepared for exactly this threat. He established a system of countermining, digging defensive tunnels beneath the fortress, from which listening posts could detect enemy mining activity. The technique was ingenious. In dark, silent chambers beneath the fortress, defenders would place bowls of water on the floor. When Ottoman miners were digging nearby, the vibrations would cause ripples in the water, indicating the direction and approximate distance of the enemy tunnel. Once they located an Ottoman mine, the defenders had several options. They could dig their own tunnel to intersect the enemy's, leading to brutal underground combat fought in total darkness with knives, swords and pistols, in spaces so confined that men couldn't stand upright. They could dig beneath the Ottoman tunnel and collapse it, burying the enemy miners alive. Or they could set up a countermine, packing their own tunnel with explosives and timing the detonation to either destroy the Ottoman mine or kill the enemy miners before they could complete their work. Over the course of the siege, Ottoman engineers attempted over 50 major mining operations. Tadino's system detected and destroyed more than 40 of them. This underground war was fought in conditions of almost unimaginable horror. Men worked by candlelight in tunnels that could collapse at any moment, listening for the sounds of enemy digging through solid earth, never knowing if the next moment would bring a blast of fire and rock as an enemy mine detonated. The air was thick with dust and smoke, making breathing difficult. The heat was oppressive. Men emerged from shifts in the tunnels looking like ghosts covered in dirt, their eyes hollowed from exhaustion and fear. But some Ottoman mines succeeded. On September 4th, 1522, two massive explosions shook the entire city of Rhodes. Ottoman sappers had successfully placed mines beneath the English bastion, and when they detonated, 36 feet of the wall collapsed into the moat, creating a huge breach. Immediately, Ottoman assault troops, led by elite Janissaries, poured forward, screaming their battle cries, scrambling over the rubble into the breach. The English knights, commanded by Fra Nicholas Hussey, met them with cold steel. What followed was some of the most savage hand-to-hand combat of the entire siege. In the confined space of the breach, there was no room for formation fighting or tactical maneuver. It was simply two groups of heavily armed men trying to kill each other in a space barely 30 feet wide. The Janissaries, elite infantry who formed the backbone of the Ottoman army, pushed forward with fanatical courage. They were slave soldiers, taken as boys from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood to be warriors. They knew only military life. They feared nothing. The English knights pushed back with equal determination. These were men who had taken religious vows to defend Christendom with their lives. Retreat was not an option. The fighting lasted for hours. Men slipped on blood and bodies as they hacked at each other with swords and axes. Defenders fired crossbows and arquebuses point blank into the mass of attackers. Ottomans hurled grenades, crude explosive devices made of clay pots filled with gunpowder and nails that showered defenders with shrapnel. Finally, Grandmaster Philippe himself arrived with reinforcements. At 58 years old, he personally led a counterattack into the breach, fighting with sword in hand, rallying the defenders with his presence. The sight of their Grand Master risking his life alongside them gave the defenders renewed strength. Slowly, bloodily, they pushed the Janissaries back. By the end of the day, the Ottomans had been driven from the breach, leaving hundreds of dead behind. The defenders immediately began building an internal wall behind the breach, creating a second line of defence in case the Ottomans broke through again. Similar attacks followed over the next weeks. On September 9th, the post of Provence was attacked following another mine explosion. On September 11th, the English sector was hit again. On September 13th, the post of Aragon faced assault. On September 14th, Provence was attacked once more. Each time the pattern was the same: a massive mine explosion followed by waves of Janissaries trying to exploit the breach before defenders could respond. Each time the knights held, but at terrible cost. Casualties mounted on both sides. The Hospitallers, with no reserves and no reinforcements, could not afford these losses. Every knight killed or wounded was irreplaceable. The Ottomans, with over 100,000 men and continuous reinforcements arriving from Anatolia, could afford to trade lives. This was a war of attrition, and time was on Suleiman's side. In October, two disasters struck the defenders. First, Gabriele Tadino, the engineering genius whose countermining operations had saved Rhodes multiple times, was shot through the face during an Ottoman assault. The bullet destroyed one of his eyes and exited through his cheek, a horrific wound that should have killed him, or at least ended his military career. Incredibly, Tadino survived. Even more incredibly, within 6 weeks he was back in action, his face bandaged, one eye gone, still directing countermining operations with the same meticulous attention to detail. His dedication became legendary among the defenders. If the half-blind engineer could still fight, how could anyone else give less than everything? The second disaster was treachery. A spy was discovered in the Hospitaller ranks, someone who had been feeding information about the fortress's defences and weak points to the Ottomans. Under torture, the spy claimed he was working for Andrea d'Amiral, the Grand Chancellor of the Order and the second most powerful man in the Knights Hospitaller, after the Grand Master himself. D'Amiral was a controversial figure. Portuguese by birth, he had been a candidate for Grand Master in the 1521 election but had lost to Philippe. Some historians believe he was bitter about this defeat and turned traitor out of personal resentment. Others argue the evidence against him was fabricated by his enemies within the order. We will never know the truth because D'Amiral was tortured but refused to confess. Without a confession, there was no definitive proof of his guilt. But the suspicion was enough. Philippe, unable to tolerate even the possibility of treason at the highest levels during a siege, ordered D'Amiral's execution. The Grand Chancellor was beheaded, his death a warning that anyone, no matter how high their rank, would be killed if they threatened the defence. The discovery of treachery, or even the suspicion of it, was devastating to morale. If the Order's own Grand Chancellor could be a traitor, who else might be secretly working for the enemy? Paranoia spread through the garrison. Knights watched each other with suspicion. Unity began to fracture along national lines as different longs accused each other of harbouring traitors. Philippe struggled to hold the defence together through force of personality and the shared sense that any further internal division would mean certain defeat. By November, both sides were exhausted. The defenders had sustained tremendous casualties. Of the original 600 knights, dozens were dead and hundreds wounded. The mercenary forces were similarly depleted. Supplies of gunpowder were running dangerously low. Food was still adequate because the defenders had stockpiled carefully, but medical supplies were nearly exhausted. The hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded. Disease, particularly dysentery, was spreading through the garrison, killing men who had survived weeks of combat. The Ottomans had suffered even worse. Estimates vary, but most historians believe Ottoman casualties by November approached 50,000 dead and wounded, perhaps more. These were staggering losses, but Suleiman still had tens of thousands of fresh troops. The problem was that Ottoman morale was cracking. The ordinary soldiers had expected a quick victory. They had been told the infidel knights would crumble before the might of Ottoman arms. Instead, they had spent months dying in futile assaults against walls that seemed impervious to destruction. The weather was turning cold. Winter was coming. Supply ships from Anatolia were facing increasingly rough seas. Disease was spreading through the Ottoman camps just as it was spreading through the fortress. Suleiman faced a difficult decision. He could withdraw, admit defeat, and return to Constantinople with nothing to show for the massive expenditure of men and resources. This would be humiliating, and might encourage rebellion among his subjects who would see him as weak. Or he could continue the siege through winter, accepting further casualties and the risk that his army might simply disintegrate from disease and desertion. He chose a third option: negotiations. In early December, Suleiman offered terms. If the defenders surrendered immediately, they would be given food, allowed to keep their lives, and permitted to leave Rhodes with their possessions. If they refused and forced the Ottomans to storm the city, everyone would be killed or enslaved, as was traditional in Islamic warfare when a city was taken by assault after refusing surrender. Philippe assembled a council to discuss the offer. The knights wanted to continue fighting. These were men who had taken vows to defend Christendom with their lives, and many were prepared to die rather than surrender. But Philippe was a realist. He looked around at his depleted garrison, his shattered walls, his dwindling supplies of gunpowder and his hospitals full of dying men, and he knew they couldn't hold out much longer. More importantly, he considered the local population, the thousands of Greek and Jewish civilians who had suffered through 5 months of bombardment and who would be slaughtered if the Ottomans stormed the city. As Grand Master, Philippe's first duty was to preserve the order so it could continue fighting elsewhere. Dying in a final glorious but futile last stand might be heroic, but it would end the Knights Hospitaller forever. A negotiated surrender might be humiliating, but it would allow the order to survive and rebuild. The negotiations began on December 11th with a truce. For 3 days the guns fell silent for the first time since July. The sudden quiet was disorienting. Defenders whose ears had been ringing for months suddenly had to adjust to silence. But when the local Rhodian population learned the knights were considering surrender, they panicked. The Greeks and Jews knew what Ottoman conquest would mean for them. They would become dhimmi, second-class subjects of an Islamic empire, required to pay special taxes, forbidden from bearing arms, subject to various social restrictions. They demanded additional assurances of their safety and rights as part of any surrender agreement. Suleiman, who had been expecting the negotiations to conclude quickly, was angered by these new demands. He saw them as the defenders trying to extract additional concessions and dictate terms to him, which was intolerable. In fury, he ordered the bombardment and assaults to resume, this time with even greater intensity. He brought in additional artillery from Anatolia, including some of the heaviest guns in the Ottoman arsenal. On December 17th, following multiple mine explosions and the most intense artillery barrage of the entire siege, the bastion of Spain fell. This time, there would be no counterattack to drive the Ottomans out. The defenders were simply too exhausted and too few. Ottoman troops poured through the breach and established positions inside the walls. It was only a matter of time now. Other sections of wall had been battered down. The defences that had held for nearly 6 months were collapsing all at once. On December 20th, Philippe requested a fresh truce. The fighting stopped. On December 22nd, representatives of both the Latin and Greek communities of Rhodes met with Ottoman officials to finalise surrender terms. Suleiman was generous in victory, perhaps because he recognised the extraordinary courage of the defenders, perhaps because he wanted to appear magnanimous, or perhaps simply because he was exhausted by the siege and wanted it over. The terms were remarkably favourable for a defeated enemy. The knights would be given 12 days to evacuate the island. They could take their weapons, their religious relics, their archives, and their personal possessions. They would not be enslaved or harmed. Any islander who wished to leave could do so at any time within a 3-year period. No church would be desecrated or converted into a mosque, at least not immediately. Those who remained on Rhodes would be exempt from Ottoman taxation for 5 years. These were extraordinarily lenient terms, far more generous than Islamic law required, and more generous than Christian armies typically offered when they captured Muslim cities. Suleiman's magnanimity earned him praise even from his enemies, and contributed to his reputation for justice that would last throughout his reign. On January 1st, 1523, the Knights Hospitaller marched out of Rhodes. Contemporary accounts describe the scene with remarkable poignancy. The knights, in full armour, carrying their banners and their holy relics, walked through streets lined with Ottoman soldiers. Suleiman himself watched from horseback as his defeated enemies departed. According to one account, perhaps apocryphal but revealing nonetheless, Suleiman remarked, "It pains me to be compelled to chase this Christian elder from his home." The old warrior he referred to was Grand Master Philippe, now 59 years old, who had held out for 6 months against overwhelming odds. The knights boarded ships provided by the Ottomans and sailed first to Crete, then to Sicily, then to various temporary refuges over the next several years. They were an order without a home, warrior monks without a fortress, knights without a kingdom. For 7 years they wandered, seeking a new base of operations. Finally, in 1530, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V granted them the islands of Malta, Gozo, and the North African port of Tripoli. From Malta, the Knights Hospitaller would continue their war against Islam for another 248 years, earning a new name as the Knights of Malta and creating a new legend during the Great Siege of Malta in 1565. But that's another story. The Siege of Rhodes of 1522 was one of the last great conflicts that bridged the medieval and modern worlds. It saw knights in armour fighting alongside artillery crews. It saw underground warfare conducted with nearly scientific precision. It saw psychological warfare, propaganda, treachery and honour, all mixed together in 6 months of sustained combat that pushed both sides to their absolute limits. The Ottoman victory was complete. Rhodes would remain under Ottoman control for the next 390 years, until it was captured by Italy during the Italo-Turkish War of 1912. The conquest solidified Ottoman dominance over the eastern Mediterranean and eliminated the last Crusader presence in the region, but the cost was staggering. Ottoman casualties probably exceeded 50,000 men, possibly as many as 70,000 if you include those who died of disease and infection after the siege ended. For the Knights Hospitaller, the loss was also heavy. Of 600 knights who began the siege, fewer than 200 survived to evacuate. Many of those survivors were wounded or sick. The financial cost of the defence had bankrupted the order's treasury, but they had survived as an institution, and they had demonstrated that even in an age of gunpowder and cannon, courage and determination could enable vastly outnumbered defenders to hold out for months against overwhelming military superiority. The siege demonstrated the power of the new military technologies of the 16th century, the massive artillery trains that could reduce medieval fortifications to rubble, the sophisticated mining techniques that could bring down walls from beneath. But it also demonstrated that these technologies had spawned equally sophisticated countermeasures, the trace Italian fortifications that could withstand prolonged bombardment, the countermining techniques that could neutralize underground attacks, the careful mathematical calculations of range and ballistics that allowed outnumbered defenders to maximize their firepower. Most of all, the Siege of Rhodes was a human story. It was 7,000 men holding out against over 100,000. It was Gabriele Tadino fighting with one eye destroyed. It was Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam, almost 60 years old, fighting hand-to-hand in breaches in the walls. It was English knights, and German knights, and French knights, and Italian knights. Men from across Europe who might have fought each other in peacetime, standing together on the ramparts because they had all taken vows to defend Christendom, and they would honour those vows even unto death. It was also the story of Suleiman the Magnificent, a young sultan proving himself, demonstrating the patience to conduct a 6-month siege when he could have withdrawn after a few weeks, showing mercy and victory when tradition allowed him to slaughter the defeated. His respect for his enemies and his generous surrender terms earned him admiration even among Christians, and established a reputation for justice that would define his 46-year reign. Today, the walls of Rhodes still stand. You can walk along the ramparts that Philippe's men defended. You can see the bastions where the worst fighting occurred, the places where mines exploded and Ottoman janissaries poured through breaches only to be driven back by counterattacking knights. You can visit the palace of the Grand Masters where Philippe directed the defence. The stones are still pockmarked with impacts from cannonballs fired 500 years ago. The Siege of Rhodes reminds us that even in defeat, even in surrender, there can be honour. The Knights Hospitaller lost their island, but they saved their order and they saved thousands of civilian lives by negotiating terms rather than fighting to the last man in a gesture of futile heroism. They understood that survival to fight another day was more important than a glorious death. And survive they did, continuing their mission in Malta, continuing to challenge Ottoman power for 2.5 more centuries, continuing to embody the ideal of warrior monks dedicated to defending Christendom. On June 26, 1522, when 700 Ottoman ships appeared on the horizon, the Knights Hospitaller stood on their walls and prepared to face the greatest military challenge in their history. 6 months later, on January 1, 1523, they marched out of Rhodes with their honour intact, their banners flying, their weapons in their hands, and their determination unbroken. They had withstood the Ottoman bombardment, not through superior firepower or greater numbers, but through courage, engineering genius, and the understanding that some things are worth defending regardless of the odds. The thunder of Ottoman cannon that shook Rhodes for 6 months eventually fell silent, but the echo of what those defenders accomplished reverberates through history still. The impact of the siege of Rhodes extended far beyond the immediate military outcome. The 6 months of fighting had demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of siege warfare in the age of gunpowder, lessons that would reshape European military thinking for the next century. Military engineers across Europe studied accounts of the siege, analysing what had worked and what had failed. The defensive innovations that Gabriele Tadino employed, particularly his systematic approach to countermining and his mathematical precision in artillery placement, became standard practice in fortress design. Universities began teaching siege engineering as a formal discipline, with Rhodes serving as the primary case study. The Ottoman military likewise drew lessons from the siege. Despite their victory, Ottoman commanders recognized that the cost had been unsustainable. Losing 50,000 or more men to capture a single island, no matter how strategically valuable, was a terrible exchange ratio. The realization that well-designed fortifications defended by determined garrisons could extract such horrific casualties would influence Ottoman strategic planning for decades. Suleiman himself never again attempted a siege of comparable duration or cost. His subsequent campaigns focused on field battles where Ottoman numerical superiority and cavalry excellence could be decisive, rather than grinding sieges against fortified positions. For the Christian kingdoms of Europe, the fall of Rhodes was a wake-up call. The Knights Hospitaller had been holding the line against Ottoman expansion in the eastern Mediterranean for over 2 centuries. With Rhodes gone, there was no significant Christian naval power east of Sicily. The Ottomans now controlled virtually every strategic point in the eastern Mediterranean. Christian shipping faced constant predation from Ottoman and Barbary corsairs. The sea lanes that had once carried trade from Venice and Genoa to the Levant were now dangerous waters where merchant vessels required armed escorts. The economic impact on Italian city-states was immediate and severe. Venice, which had maintained profitable trading relationships with Ottoman territories, despite their rival status, found its merchants facing increased taxation and restrictions. Genoa lost access to several key ports entirely. The spice trade, which had enriched Italian merchants for centuries, began shifting toward routes controlled by Portuguese explorers who were pioneering sea lanes around Africa to reach the Indies directly, bypassing Ottoman-controlled land routes entirely. The political ramifications were equally significant. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who ruled over vast territories including Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and German principalities, recognized that the Ottoman Empire now posed an existential threat to Christian Europe. The loss of Rhodes meant the Ottomans could project naval power throughout the Mediterranean without opposition. Charles understood that unless a new bulwark against Ottoman expansion could be established, the entire Mediterranean basin might fall under Turkish control. This strategic concern was why he granted Malta to the Knights Hospitaller in 1530. He needed a military force capable of challenging Ottoman naval supremacy, and the Knights, despite their defeat at Rhodes, had proven they were the only organisation with the discipline, courage and expertise to do so. The grant of Malta wasn't charity. It was strategic necessity. Charles needed the Knights as much as they needed a new home. The 7 years between the fall of Rhodes and the settlement in Malta were difficult for the order. The Knights initially took refuge in Crete, still under Venetian control, but Venice was nervous about hosting them. The Venetians maintained complex diplomatic and economic relationships with the Ottoman Empire, and harbouring the order's most determined enemies could jeopardise those relationships. After a few months, Venice politely but firmly asked the Knights to leave. From Crete they moved to Sicily, where they received a warmer welcome from Spanish authorities. But Sicily was not suitable as a permanent base. It was too far from Ottoman territories to serve as an effective launching point for naval operations, and the Knights couldn't afford to purchase or fortify a suitable location on the island. They spent several years essentially homeless, their galleys operating from temporary harbours, their knights scattered across various European countries, the order's administration functioning from rented buildings in Rome. Grand Master Philippe Villiers de l'Isle-Adam spent these years in constant diplomatic activity, travelling between European courts, petitioning monarchs for support, negotiating for a new permanent home. He was now in his 60s, his health broken by the strain of the siege and its aftermath. He had given everything to preserve the order, and he was determined to secure its future before he died. His persistence finally paid off in 1530 when Charles V offered Malta. The grant came with conditions. The knights would hold Malta, Gozo and Tripoli as fiefs of the Holy Roman Empire, owing feudal obligations to Charles and his successors. They would be required to present a falcon to the emperor's representative each year on All Saints' Day as symbolic recognition of his overlordship. This would become the famous Maltese falcon of literary fame. More importantly, they would be required to defend these territories against all enemies, particularly the Ottomans, and to maintain their naval operations against Muslim shipping. These were obligations the knights were eager to accept. Fighting the Ottomans was their reason for existence. Having a secure base from which to do so was exactly what they needed. Malta in 1530 was vastly different from Rhodes. Where Rhodes had been a prosperous island with a large population, impressive fortifications and a thriving economy, Malta was poor, sparsely populated, and almost entirely unfortified. The island's population was perhaps 12,000 people, mostly impoverished farmers and fishermen. There were no significant towns, no deep water harbours suitable for large ships, no walls or castles capable of withstanding a serious military assault. The soil was thin and rocky, agriculture was barely sufficient to feed the local population, and there were no natural resources to trade. Fresh water was scarce, depending on seasonal rainfall collected in cisterns. Many of the knights who first saw Malta were horrified. After ruling over the prosperous and beautiful island of Rhodes for over 2 centuries, they were being asked to settle on barren rocks in the middle of the Mediterranean. Some knights openly questioned whether Malta was worth accepting. Perhaps they should continue searching for a better location. Perhaps they should petition for somewhere in Italy or southern France. But Philippe saw what others missed. Malta's strategic location was extraordinary. Positioned almost exactly in the centre of the Mediterranean, it sat astride the sea lanes between the western and eastern basins. Any Ottoman fleet sailing from Constantinople towards Spain, Italy or North Africa would pass within striking distance of Malta. The islands could serve as a base for naval operations against Ottoman shipping and as a forward warning post of Ottoman fleet movements. Moreover, Malta's very poverty was an advantage. The Ottomans had wanted Rhodes desperately because it was wealthy and strategically located. They might not bother attacking Malta because it seemed worthless. The knights could build it into a fortress without immediately attracting Ottoman attention. Philippe accepted the grant. The Knights Hospitaller became the Knights of Malta. But Philippe would not live to see what his order would accomplish from their new home. He died in 1534, 4 years after the move to Malta, worn out by the siege, the years of exile and the effort of re-establishing the order. He was 70 years old and had served as Grand Master for 13 difficult years. His successor, Pietro del Ponte, continued the work of fortifying Malta and rebuilding the order's strength. The knights immediately began construction of fortifications, but progress was slow. The order's treasury had been depleted by the siege and the years of exile. They had to rely on donations from European supporters and on income from their properties scattered across Europe. Each of the order's langs maintained estates in their home countries, commanderies that generated revenue to support the knights' military operations. These incomes were substantial, but building fortifications was expensive, and the knights had to balance military construction with maintaining their fleet and feeding their members. The initial fortifications were modest. The knights began by fortifying the small town of Birgu on a peninsula overlooking the Grand Harbour, building walls and bastions according to the latest principles they had learned at Rhodes. They constructed Fort St. Angelo at the tip of the peninsula, a massive fortress that could control the harbour entrance with artillery fire. Across the harbour, they built Fort St. Elmo on the tip of another peninsula, creating a crossfire that would make forcing the harbour entrance extremely difficult. These fortifications would prove their worth 35 years later during the Great Siege of Malta in 1565. Meanwhile, the knights resumed their naval operations against Ottoman and Muslim shipping. Their galleys ranged across the Mediterranean, attacking Turkish merchant vessels, raiding Ottoman coastal towns, and generally making themselves as troublesome as possible. They captured Muslim ships and either sank them or brought them back to Malta as prizes, selling the cargo and enslaving the crews according to the brutal customs of Mediterranean warfare in that era. These raids served multiple purposes. They generated income for the order through the sale of prizes and slaves, they disrupted Ottoman trade and communications, and they kept the knights' fighting skills sharp through constant combat. The Knights of Malta became the most skilled naval fighters in the Mediterranean. Their galleys veered from Constantinople to Algiers. But these operations also ensured that the Ottomans would never forget about the knights, or forgive them for their continued resistance. Sultan Suleiman, who had shown such magnanimity in victory at Rhodes, never forgot that the knights he had allowed to leave with honour had simply relocated and continued their war against his empire. From his perspective, his mercy had been thrown back in his face. He began planning to finish what he had started at Rhodes. The decades following the fall of Rhodes saw the Ottoman Empire reach the height of its power. Suleiman's armies conquered Belgrade in 1521, defeated Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, and besieged Vienna in 1529, coming within 100 miles of the heart of the Holy Roman Empire before being turned back. In the east, Ottoman forces conquered Baghdad in 1534, bringing Mesopotamia under Turkish control. In North Africa, Ottoman forces and allied corsairs captured Algiers, Tunis and Tripoli, establishing Ottoman dominance along the entire southern Mediterranean coast. By the 1550s, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from the Crimea to Yemen. It was the largest empire in the world, ruling over perhaps 30 million people across 3 continents. Against this colossus, the Knights of Malta seemed insignificant, a few hundred warriors on barren islands, clinging to an anachronistic crusading ideal that the rest of Europe had largely abandoned. But those few hundred warriors were inflicting damage far out of proportion to their numbers. Knight galleys captured hundreds of Ottoman merchant ships in the decades after settling Malta. They raided coastal towns across the Ottoman Empire, from the Aegean to the Levant to North Africa. They provided naval intelligence to Christian kingdoms, warning of Ottoman fleet movements and military preparations. And they served as a symbol of Christian resistance, proof that the Ottoman advance could be challenged. By 1565, Suleiman had had enough. He was now 71 years old, in the final years of his reign, and he wanted to eliminate this persistent irritant before he died. The Knights of Malta were the last remnant of the Crusades, the last Christian military force actively fighting the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean. Destroying them would complete his legacy and secure Ottoman naval supremacy forever. He ordered the largest military expedition of his reign to be prepared. The fleet that assembled in Constantinople in the spring of 1565 numbered nearly 200 ships carrying 40,000 soldiers, including thousands of Janissaries, the empire's elite infantry. The expedition was commanded by Mustafa Pasha, an experienced general who had participated in many of Suleiman's campaigns. The goal was simple: capture Malta, exterminate the Knights Hospitaller, and establish permanent Ottoman control over the central Mediterranean. When word of this massive Ottoman build-up reached Malta, Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette, who now led the order, faced the same situation Philippe had faced at Rhodes. He commanded approximately 500 knights and perhaps 8,000 other defenders, including Maltese militia and mercenaries. Against him was coming an Ottoman force of 40,000 men, supported by massive artillery and the best military minds in the empire. European kingdoms were once again too distracted by their own conflicts to send meaningful help. The knights would stand alone. But this time, several factors were different. The knights had learned from Rhodes. They had spent 35 years fortifying Malta, building defences that incorporated every lesson from the 1522 siege. They had deeper moats, thicker walls, more sophisticated bastions, and better artillery positions than Rhodes had possessed. Most importantly, they had preparation time. Unlike at Rhodes, where the Ottoman fleet appeared with limited warning, the knights at Malta knew the attack was coming months in advance. They stripped the countryside of food and poisoned wells, exactly as they had at Rhodes. They stockpiled ammunition and gunpowder in quantities they hadn't possessed in 1522. They recruited every available fighting man from the local population and put them through intensive training. They repaired and reinforced every section of wall. They dug additional countermine tunnels beneath the fortifications, and they sent urgent messages to every Christian kingdom in Europe, begging for relief forces. Most importantly, Valette made a crucial strategic decision. He would not simply defend and hope the Ottomans gave up. He would make them pay for every foot of ground, bleed them white, drag out the siege until the campaigning season ended and Ottoman logistics collapsed. He understood that time was his greatest weapon. The longer the siege lasted, the more Ottoman casualties would mount, the more disease would spread through their camps, the more their supply lines would be strained, and the greater the chance that a Christian relief force might arrive. The Great Siege of Malta began on May 18, 1565, when the Ottoman fleet arrived off the coast. It would last until September 11, 1565, nearly 4 months of continuous combat that would prove even more savage than Rhodes. The Ottomans focused their initial attacks on Fort St. Elmo, the fortress guarding the entrance to the Grand Harbour. They expected to capture it in days. It took them a month and cost them 8,000 casualties. Every day, Ottoman assault troops stormed the walls of St. Elmo. Every day, the defenders threw them back with artillery, arquebuses, hand grenades, and boiling oil. Every night, Maltese swimmers would slip across the harbour from Birgu, carrying ammunition and reinforcements to St. Elmo, then returning with wounded. When St. Elmo finally fell on June 23rd, there were no survivors among the defenders. Every night, every soldier, every Maltese militiaman who had held the fort was dead. The Ottomans had won, but the victory had cost them a month they couldn't afford, and casualties that devastated morale. The siege continued through the brutal Mediterranean summer. Ottoman forces attacked Birgu and Senglea, the fortified towns on either side of the Grand Harbour, with the same fury they had shown at St. Elmo. The defenders, inspired by Valette who fought on the walls despite being 71 years old, held on through sheer determination. Mining and counter-mining beneath the fortifications created an underground war as savage as the fighting on the surface. Artillery bombardments reduced sections of wall to rubble. Ottoman assault troops poured through breaches only to be cut down by concentrated defensive fire. Disease spread through both the Ottoman camps and the Christian fortifications. Food ran short on both sides. The August heat was unbearable, men fighting in full armour under the Mediterranean sun, the stench of thousands of unburied bodies filling the air. By September, both sides were exhausted and on the verge of collapse. The Ottomans had lost over 20,000 men, perhaps as many as 30,000. The knights had lost half their number. The local population had been decimated. Then, on September 7th, a relief force of 8,000 Spanish and Italian soldiers arrived from Sicily. It wasn't large enough to defeat the Ottomans in open battle, but it didn't need to be. The Ottoman army was exhausted, diseased, and demoralized. When they learned that Christian reinforcements had landed, Ottoman morale collapsed. On September 11, 1565, the Ottoman fleet withdrew, abandoning the siege. The knights had won. The victory at Malta in 1565 was even more improbable than the defence of Rhodes in 1522. At Rhodes, the knights had at least forced the Ottomans into a negotiated settlement. At Malta, they had actually defeated them outright, driven them from the island, and preserved their order for another 200 years. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. For Christian Europe, Malta proved that the Ottomans were not invincible, that their seemingly unstoppable expansion could be halted by determined resistance. For the Ottomans, Malta was a humiliating defeat that shattered the aura of invincibility they had built over decades of continuous victory. Suleiman the Magnificent died the following year in 1566, during a campaign in Hungary, never having avenged his defeat at Malta. The Knights of Malta would continue their existence until 1798, when Napoleon seized the islands during his expedition to Egypt. By then, the order had evolved from a crusading military force into something closer to a charitable organisation, though they maintained their traditions and their galleys. After Napoleon expelled them, they became a sovereign entity without territory, a unique status they maintain today as the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, recognised by over 100 countries and operating hospitals and humanitarian missions worldwide. But it all traced back to Rhodes, the 6 months in 1522 when a few hundred knights held off over 100,000 Ottoman soldiers through courage, engineering genius, and sheer bloody-minded determination. The lessons learned at Rhodes, the fortification techniques, the counter-mining methods, the psychological warfare, The understanding that defence was as much about morale and endurance as about walls and weapons, all of it was passed down and perfected over decades until it achieved ultimate vindication at Malta. The Siege of Rhodes was technically a defeat, but it was a defeat that preserved the order to fight again. It demonstrated that even in an age of gunpowder and mass armies, small forces defending prepared positions could inflict unacceptable casualties on attackers. This lesson would be proven again and again over the following centuries, at Malta, at Vienna in 1683 when Polish forces relieved the Habsburg capital from Ottoman siege, at countless fortresses across Europe where defenders demonstrated that stone walls, artillery and courage could overcome numerical superiority. The technological innovations that emerged from the Rhodes siege, particularly the trace Italian fortifications with their low thick walls and angled bastions, would dominate military architecture until the late 19th century. Even today, if you study the fortifications built by Vauban in France in the 1600s, or the star forts built by various European powers in their colonies worldwide, or the defensive works that protected cities up through the American Civil War, you can trace their design principles directly back to what Gabriele Tadino and his contemporaries developed at Rhodes. The human element of the siege remains equally instructive. Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam faced an impossible situation, vastly outnumbered, under constant bombardment, his defences crumbling, his men dying. With no hope of relief and no possibility of victory, yet he kept fighting for 6 months, not out of blind fanaticism, but because he understood his duty was to preserve his order and protect the civilians under his care. When he finally negotiated surrender, he did so on terms that achieved both objectives. He saved the order to fight another day, and he saved thousands of civilian lives. That required a different kind of courage than simply fighting to the death, the courage to accept what looked like defeat in order to achieve long-term survival and ultimate purpose. The Ottoman perspective deserves equal consideration. Suleiman the Magnificent is often portrayed in European histories as a brutal tyrant, but the evidence from Rhodes shows a more complex figure. He prosecuted the siege with relentless determination, committing enormous resources to what became an extraordinarily costly victory. But when victory was finally achieved, he showed remarkable magnanimity, offering terms that went far beyond what was required by law or custom. His generosity toward defeated enemies who had fought him for 6 months earned him respect even among Christians and established a reputation for justice that defined his 46-year reign. Suleiman understood something that many military commanders miss, that how you treat defeated enemies affects your reputation and can make future enemies more willing to negotiate rather than fight to the death. The favourable terms he offered at Rhodes probably saved Ottoman lives at other sieges, where defenders surrendered rather than fighting hopelessly because they knew Suleiman kept his word. The ordinary soldiers on both sides, the Janissaries storming breaches under withering fire, the Hospitaller knights standing in those breaches fighting hand to hand until they dropped from exhaustion, the miners on both sides working in darkness beneath the earth, never knowing if the next moment would bring enemy steel or an explosive blast. All of them demonstrated extraordinary courage in the service of causes larger than themselves. Modern observers might question the religious ideologies that motivated this conflict, the Christian crusading ideal versus Islamic jihad, but questioning the courage of the men who fought would be absurd. They faced horrors we can barely imagine with a bravery that demands respect across the centuries. The civilian population of Rhodes, both Christian and Jewish, endured 6 months of constant bombardment, starvation, disease, and the ever-present knowledge that if the walls fell, they would be enslaved or killed. Their survival was testament to human resilience and to the protective efforts of the knights, who negotiated their safety as part of the surrender terms. The legacy of the Siege of Rhodes extends beyond military history. It represents one of the last moments when medieval chivalry confronted modernity and, for a brief time, held its own. The Knights Hospitaller were an institution from the 12th century, warrior monks following rules established during the Crusades, fighting according to codes of honour that were already becoming obsolete. Against them came the Ottoman Empire, representing the cutting edge of 16th century military technology, with massive artillery trains, sophisticated siege engineering, and administrative systems that could support armies of over 100,000 men in foreign territory for months at a time. The clash between these two worldviews, medieval and modern, produced a siege that pushed both sides to their absolute limits and ultimately demonstrated that neither old nor new alone guaranteed victory. The knights' medieval courage and discipline, combined with Renaissance engineering and military science, proved capable of matching Ottoman modernity and technology, backed by enormous numerical superiority. This synthesis of old and new was perhaps the most important lesson of Rhodes. Neither pure tradition nor pure innovation was sufficient. The knights couldn't have held Rhodes without Tadino's mathematical precision and engineering expertise, his understanding of ballistics and angles of fire, his systematic approach to counter-mining. But Tadino's technical brilliance would have been worthless without the knights' discipline and courage, their willingness to stand in breaches and fight hand to hand, their refusal to consider surrender until every other option was exhausted. Victory in siege warfare required both: the technical expertise to build defences and employ weapons effectively, and the human qualities of courage, endurance, and leadership to maintain morale through months of horror. The Ottomans learned similar lessons. Their victory at Rhodes came not just from superior numbers and artillery, but from Suleiman's patience and willingness to accept heavy casualties, from the Janissary's disciplined assault tactics, from the miners' technical skill and bravery in underground warfare. The siege demonstrated that even the most advanced technology of the age couldn't guarantee quick victory against properly designed defences manned by determined troops. These lessons remained relevant for centuries. During the world wars of the 20th century, defenders at Verdun, at Stalingrad, at Monte Cassino, demonstrated that fortified positions defended by determined troops could extract horrific casualties from attackers, regardless of technological advantages. The basic calculus established at Rhodes still applied. Attackers need overwhelming superiority in firepower and numbers to overcome prepared defences, and even then, the cost might be unacceptable. The nuclear age and precision-guided weapons have changed this calculus somewhat. But even today, military planners recognise that urban warfare and siege situations favour defenders, and that attacking fortified positions remains the most costly form of combat. The echoes of Rhodes persist even in contemporary military doctrine. On a human level, the Siege of Rhodes reminds us of what people are capable of when fighting for something they believe in. The knights believed they were defending Christendom and fulfilling sacred vows. The Ottomans believed they were expanding the domain of Islam and serving their sultan. Modern observers might question these religious motivations, might see the conflict as a pointless waste of life over incompatible ideologies, but that perspective misses something essential. The meaning people find in their causes, whether we agree with those causes or not, gives them the strength to endure extraordinary hardship and face death with courage. The defenders of Rhodes found meaning in their stand against impossible odds. That meaning sustained them through 6 months of hell. The Ottoman soldiers found meaning in their service to Sultan and faith. That meaning drove them to assault walls again and again despite staggering casualties. We might wish they had found meaning in more constructive endeavours, but we cannot deny the power of meaning to enable human endurance and sacrifice. The physical evidence of the Siege of Rhodes survives today for those willing to seek it out. The walls of the old city of Rhodes still stand, though restored and maintained as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You can walk the same ramparts where Philippe's knights stood watching the Ottoman fleet arrive. You can see the Palace of the Grand Masters, rebuilt by the Italians in the early 20th century but following the original floor plan. You can visit the archaeological museum housed in the Old Knights Hospital, where the wounded were treated during the siege. The bastions and gates bear plaques identifying which Lang defended each section. The harbour, though now filled with tourist yachts and cruise ships, retains its basic shape, and you can imagine the chains stretched across the entrance to keep out Ottoman warships. The town itself, with its narrow medieval streets and stone buildings, looks much as it did in 1522, though without the scars of bombardment and the smell of gunpowder. Standing on those walls today, looking out at the peaceful blue waters of the Aegean, it requires imagination to visualize 700 Ottoman ships appearing on that horizon, to hear the thunder of bombardment that shook the city for 6 months, to imagine the breaches filled with struggling men hacking at each other in desperate combat. But the stones remember. The walls that absorbed the impact of thousands of cannonballs remember. The bastions where so many died on both sides remember. And those of us who study this history remember and try to understand what it meant, what it cost, and what lessons it still has to teach us about courage, endurance, leadership, and the human capacity to face impossible odds without surrendering hope. the Siege of Rhodes. 5 centuries ago demonstrated that even against overwhelming power, even facing certain defeat, resistance is possible and meaningful. The knights lost Rhodes, but they preserved their order, saved thousands of lives, and maintained their purpose. 35 years later at Malta, they proved that Rhodes had not been in vain, that the lessons learned in defeat could be applied to achieve victory. The thunder of Ottoman bombardment that shook Rhodes in 1522 eventually fell silent. The guns were withdrawn, the soldiers departed, and life returned to something like normal under new Ottoman administration. But what those defenders accomplished, the stand they made, the courage they showed, continues to echo through the centuries, reminding us that some things are worth defending even when victory seems impossible, and that how we face defeat can be as important as how we achieve victory.